Hello and welcome to another episode of the Aranex podcast, the podcast looking at all that's changing around the maritime shipping and ocean space. My name's Craig Eason, I'm your host, and I'm also the owner and editor of Fathom World. Now, this is a bit like what's happening in Europe, because I'm actually in Brussels, and it just coincides with news that the discussions within the European Union body, which is looking at the development of the emissions trading scheme, have provisionally agreed something relating to shipping. And it's fairly big news. So with me is Sotiris Raptis from ECSA, the European Community Ship Owners Association, and Faig Abbasov from T&E, Transport and Environment. Let's start with Sotiris, because this is going to impact shipping. We've got provisionally coming out of the trilogue, which is the discussions between the Commission, or rather, more importantly, it's the discussions between the Parliament and the Council, with the Commission being there as well. What are we likely to see now? What has been agreed in terms of shipping and the ETS? What's going to happen?
First of all, we need to see the final text. There is reportedly a provisional agreement. We know from the side of the Parliament the basic points included in this provisional agreement, but we haven't seen yet any text. From the information in the press, what is important for us is that it seems to be earmarking part of the shipping revenues, shipping ETS revenues, under the Innovation Fund. The rapporteur is talking on Twitter today about the earmarking of 20 million ETS allowances. This number corresponds to around 1.5 billion euros only for the maritime sector. It seems that shipping will be the only sector that has got earmarked revenues under the Innovation Fund. Current estimations are about, when it comes to the total pie, have found that the billions, the revenues under the Innovation Fund, around 10 billion euros. Faig, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the latest estimation. Of course, this is subject to a final agreement. And shipping is taking 1.5 billion out of that. What is also important is that under the earmarking, the territoriality requirement has been removed, and projects that get financing under the Innovation Fund have to bring EU added value, but they don't need to be carried out in EU territory. And third point that is really important for us is that it's not about breakthrough technologies, as is the case for other sectors under the Innovation Fund. The co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council have recognized that shipping is one of the most difficult to decarbonise, and they have extended the scope of the Innovation Fund, covering also ship efficiency, port infrastructure, innovation, and importantly, the uptake of clean fuels in the sector.
How is that? Well, actually, go to Faig first, because is this good news from T&E's perspective? What's happening now? Bearing in mind, as Sotiris said, bearing in mind that it's not complete yet. But are you happy with what you've seen coming out of the discussion so far?
We're very happy with the way the discussions have gone. Obviously, you could always aim higher, and we should always aim higher. And there were more ambitious proposals on the table, but the final deal, as it has leaked to the media, it has been reported by the rapporteur, as Sotiris mentioned, is a very good deal. It will be the first time international shipping will be subject to carbon pricing, and it will be the first time such a measure will cover not only CO2 emissions, but also methane emissions as well as nitrous oxide emissions. And also, I agree with my colleague that it's not only carbon pricing, but it's also carbon pricing as well as recycling mechanism, meaning that revenues will be finding its way. Parts of the revenues will be recycled back to the sector to help transition in this debate. But also, there are many other good elements as well. Ships, small general cargo ships as well as offshore vessels will be required to report their emissions as well. And that could be a subject for negotiation in the future for their inclusion in the ETS as well. And that's a very interesting area because those ships are small, they have lower power requirements, they sail around the European coast. That means that they could technically be decarbonized today. So in the future review, the EU will take this into account in terms of extending ETS to that.
What's the first year that ship owners, and we've got to distinguish here, it is the ship owners who are the reporting entity, is it? Is it the ship owners? And what year are they going to have to submit their first year of data?
2024, paying in 2025.
But there's a phasing mechanism, isn't there?
There's a phasing mechanism, meaning that 40% of the emissions will be covered the first year of the system, going gradually up to 100% in a 3-year period, over a 3-year period. But another point that is really important for us, and this is something that we have been campaigning for a long time, is to address the right entity, to introduce mandatory requirements for the pass-through of the costs to the commercial operators when the ship owner is not responsible for running their ships. Because in some segments of shipping, we've got ship owners that are asset managers, and it's not only about the different business models in the sector, it's also about the environmental consistency of the measure. If the commercial operator is not addressed, then the entity that takes decisions that affect the CO2 emissions of the ship are not encouraged to implement efficiency measures on board. So this is really important. And under the deal, there are mandatory requirements for the pass-through of the cost of the ETS cost to the commercial operators.
So it's going to be the commercial operators, bearing in mind what you said there, Faig, about it's not just CO2. So CO2, you can get that data from looking at the fuel that's been put on board, fuel delivery notes, for example, bunker delivery notes, sorry. But when we're taking in other emissions, as Faig said, like methane and that, how is that going to be accounted for? How do you see that being resolved in terms of being able to accurately measure those kind of emissions?
We'll have to check the details of the deal, but my understanding is that it's going to be the same monitoring method. But Faig, maybe you have more information on that.
Indeed. There's a parallel regulation called Fuel EU Maritime that will cover methane and nitrous oxide, and there is a well-developed methodology to account for those emissions. And the same methodology will be part of the global life cycle accounting mechanism that IMO is working on. So there's a lot of work that has already been done. What we need to do is just to use the same existing methodology to apply to ETS. It will not require additional administrative burden on ships because everything that you need to do that calculation is already reported. It's just one additional automatized step to derive the methane as well as nitrous oxide emissions from the existing data. So
that's a very good point because, well, 2 points there. First of all is you've got this link between the ETS and Fuel EU Maritime and other EU-related legislation that's coming in under this Fit for 55 that link to shipping, and also this connection to what's going on at the IMO as well. So this is all pushing a sort of a wave of legislation into the shipping industry, Sotiris, which is all connected to each other. But let me go back a little bit as well, because you mentioned 1.5 billion euros that could be going on an annual basis.
No, up to 2030.
Up to 2030. Yeah. So it's a total of 1.5 billion up until 2030 that shipping in its...
At least.
What sort of... You said that it doesn't have to have that, it's not as directly focused on being in Europe as it was. But what sort of projects, what sort of things can that money go to?
You can only speculate at that moment. And this is the task for the next day, to get engaged in the implementation phase and to be in contact with the policymakers and with the Commission when they decide how to spend the money. But this is the question of tomorrow. And this is why we need to still work hard. And this is why we call the provisional deal as an opportunity and as something that can mark a turning point in the decarbonization of the shipping sector. A lot of stuff needs to be done yet, but this is a stepping stone. How to spend the money? It's already encouraging. As I said before, that the fund is opening up. They can finance more projects. It's not only about breakthrough technologies. It's also about retrofitting. It can be also about retrofitting, ship efficiency, port infrastructure, and importantly, to bridge the gap, the substantial price gap between clean fuels and fuels currently used by ships.
So this is the contracts for difference discussion.
Yeah.
How do you see that working, Faig? Have you got any sort of insights or ideas of how we can bring in contracts for difference into the shipping industry?
Indeed, we have been campaigning for contracts for difference, or carbon contracts for difference. There are two versions of it since 2019, specifically for shipping. In the context of extension of ETS to cover shipping. Ultimately, the biggest cost in the overall cost structure is the fuel, operation of ships rather. And as ships will be required to switch to alternative, more expensive fuel, that means that the fuel's share in the overall operational cost will be even bigger. In terms of alternative fuels, we know what kind of fuels that can be sustainable and scalable. There's a lot of research on that one. We also know that they're very expensive. And the more sustainable, the more scalable it gets, the more expensive they become. Ultimately, if you leave it to the market will never be able to bridge that gap. The gap is too big. Sometimes 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 6 times more expensive. So what we need to do is we need to create a mechanism that helps the first mover, especially the first mover companies, to be able to use those alternative fuels, but still be in operation, not to go bust, right? And the carbon contracts for difference, if applied to the user, to the shipping companies, can help pay for that gap. If that system is applied to the suppliers, that means that suppliers will get subsidies from the European Union and provide that fuel at a competitive to HFO price at the port. So depending on how you design it, you can have different actors involved. But ultimately, as Sotiris rightly mentioned, this is not being discussed today. It was not discussed yesterday. That will be a subject for discussions after the ETS is wrapped up. There is an implementing legislation that will be proposed by the European Commission, and that will define who they're going to be subsidizing, how much money is going to be getting, what are the criteria to select those projects. But what we know, and that's a big win, shipping will have its dedicated calls. In the past, ships would have to compete with planes, with cars, with power plants, cement factories for the money that's being tendered.
So having this separate fund, this 1.5 billion, which will be dedicated to shipping or shipping-related areas, like you mentioned, the market sector.
To clarify two things there. Number one, it is a huge change in the policy. Up until a few months ago, it was a taboo to even think that innovation fund could ring fence money for one particular sector. We managed to, fix that problem. When I say we, I mean collectively. Secondly, 1.5 billion is an underestimation there. Ultimately, the way it's designed is about the 20 million allowances that will be sold to finance shipping. That 20
it's
million
the price of them on the market.
Exactly. So if you use 80 euros per ton of CO2 today, you're getting 1.6 billion. But given that kind of the time frame is up to 2030, we could only expect allowance price to go up and not down. That means that the amount of money that will be available for shipping could be even bigger. So 1.5, what Sotiris is referring to, we usually say 1.6, would likely be a floor and not a ceiling. Most likely more money will be available. And the third point, this is at the EU level. Most of the ETS revenues will still go to national budgets. And member states are free to spend those ETS revenues on shipping as well through national budgets. They're already encouraged to do that from other sectors. Obviously, they are not specifically pointing out spending on cement.
And that was exactly the argument of the Commission at the beginning against the earmarking of the revenues under the Innovation Fund. that in other sectors, the money anyway is recycled back to the industry. And as a matter of fact, 80% of the current ETS revenues are used for the energy transition of the ETS sectors. And the Commission and the member states were saying why you're asking for preferential access to the revenues. The thing, though, is that, and this is where we had to make a strong point about the special nature of the industry. It's an international industry, and as we see now, under the scope, it's also international voyages, EU-related, but international voyages included. This is why we need earmark money at European level as well. And our industry never campaigned for free allowances, but instead we said that we need our part, our share, under the innovation fund. It was a difficult fight. We at the last during the last weeks were expecting that special calls will be in the deal, but we didn't expect a number. And this is the outcome of hard work coming from all the industry stakeholders and the NGOs. We managed to have a common, strong voice and convince the policymakers that without recycling the money back to the industry, decarbonization cannot happen. And we're not here to invent the wheel. We need to draw lessons from other sectors, how they did it the last 20 years in Europe. The ETS has operated as a big fund to incentivize, to encourage the uptake of clean fuels and renewable fuels. It wasn't really the price signal 5-6 years ago that pushed the power sector to start decarbonizing. It was different measures, and there we've got the Fuel EU Maritime, and this is why we also need an ambitious Fuel EU Maritime. And if you bring all these different measures together, where the ETS really contributes is that it sends a signal to the market, but it also recycles the revenues back to the industries. Importantly, to bridge the price gap. The price gap is substantial in all sectors, more substantial in the shipping industry.
Good. Thank you very much, both of you, for giving me some insight.
A point of criticism on the deal. The IMO clause. We would like to see much stronger language for the alignment of the two systems. We understand that there is a reference that the two systems shall be coherent, but we would like to see much stronger language and a full alignment of the two systems when the IMO comes up with their own measures.
Just quickly to react to that, I think it was a very good decision on the part of the legislators not to preemptively give up on their sovereignty and on their responsibility to keep on acting on shipping emissions at the EU level and not to prejudge the outcome of the IMO. I think the experience with aviation gives us a lot of ground to expect that international negotiations usually return a lowest common denominator, and that you don't want to give up something that's more ambitious for the sake of having just a global measure. And I think the regulators have drawn good lessons from that, and that having those safeguards in place that will consider coherent application of those two systems as opposed to giving up on the EU and taking IMO as for granted. I think from the environmental perspective, as a representative of NGO, we're very content with that outcome.
Good. Well, Sotiris, Faig, thank you very much for allowing me to come and have a chat with you today here in Brussels. This is Craig Eason on the AeroNext podcast. You can find more about this and other subjects relating to regulation, shipping and transformation, and the ETS, of course, if you go to fathom.world. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and look for the podcast, and make sure you like this to get any other updates. Thank you and goodbye.